So in my last lecture, I mentioned, and it's been a lot of more than mentioned, it's been a lot of time talking about the importance of care of the poor to the fathers of the Oxford movement and the connection they saw between the care of the poor and the doctrine of the Eucharist, and specifically the idea that in the Eucharist we actually encounter Christ. And so in this session, we're going to spend some time talking about what it means to say that we are called to the care of the poor in Christian theology and what this means for Christian ethics. So we have three very different readings today. We have our reading some sermons that John Chrysostom gave, which are famous for being very strong statements in the early church about the crucial mandate for care of the poor among Christians. We have a reflection by Daniel Bell, a contemporary Lutheran theologian, on the connection between justice. And remember, justice is one of the acquired virtues that we've been talking about, and care of the poor, and specifically placing this into context of liberation theology, which remember we also talked about when we were reading James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez, when we talked about experience as a category for understanding theological ethics. And then we have a couple of reflections by Dorothy Day, who I assume most of you are familiar with, but if you're not, Dorothy Day was a prominent Roman Catholic in the 1930s who started what is called the Catholic Worker Movement, which is still extant today, which is comprised of lay people living in community who take seriously Jesus' discussions about the obligation to care for the poor and the Christian tradition of caring for the poor, and try to live this out in their day-to-day life. So in this, we have a combination of virtue ethics, the discussion of justice, specifically infused justice, and how we understand justice in our discussion around care for the poor, liberation theology, the criteria of experience, the criteria of tradition, are expressed both by Chrysostom and Day. So we have the development of tradition across time, looking at how this expression of the poor is carried out. And of course, in each of these examples, we're engaging with Scripture. We're seeing how different Christians are continuing to live out God's call to care for the poor as it's articulated and expressed in Scripture. So this really shows how all of the elements that we've been talking about are brought together. So in the Chrysostom readings, we see probably the most forceful statement, a very explicit reflection on the parables of Jesus as relating to the poor. And Chrysostom does not pull his punches. He is very strong. He's strong in a way you would never hear in the pulpit of a contemporary church. And he has a very serious and almost, let me see how I'd say this. When we talk about caring for the poor, I think we tend to place limits. Chrysostom doesn't place limits. These homilies should make you feel uncomfortable. They should shock you. And I think you need to ask, how is, taking these sources of Scripture and tradition seriously, how do these call us to live? What obligations do these sources for moral theology provide for us? In the Dorothy Day reflections, what I really want to highlight, what I think is significant here, goes back to the heart of the Catholic Worker Movement. And one of the things that is really important in the Catholic Worker Movement is, again, in response to Scripture, seeking to remove the divide between the rich. And by rich, they don't mean like rich kids of Instagram. They mean anybody who has enough money to meet their daily needs with any type of surplus, and the poor. so that those involved in the Catholic worker movement come to live with the poor. And what Day encourages us to think about is how care for the poor goes beyond simply giving money. That care for the poor requires a recognition of the dignity of all people, the dignity of the poor, and requires recognizing the fact that poverty may look different than we imagine. I think when we think about poverty, we think about the homeless person by the side of the road or the people we may have encountered on mission trips. And she reminds us, and this goes back to my point about the Fathers of the Oxford movement and their work in the parish, that poverty may look like a lack of stability, that it may look like constant stress and anxiety to make ends meet. So there's a sense here that the poor can also be the working poor, not just those who are destitute. So she wants to expand our imagination both as to what we owe the poor as Christians and who are the poor. So on to the Bell piece, which is the contemporary reflection essay. And here's what I want to ask you to think about in relationship with the Bell piece. He spends a lot of time talking about justice, what justice means, and how we think about the rights and the goods. And a lot of our discussion in our contemporary context around poverty is based on a concept of justice and right. And I'll tell you what I think that concept is, which is specifically, I earned X. I achieved X. To give to someone else, to expect me to give to someone else, church, to make me give to someone else, government, is unjust. You are infringing on my right. The poor have no demands in justice upon me because of what I have achieved. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not this understanding of justice lines up with the Christian tradition. Is this, to go back to our first unit, is this freedom to use our resources as we desire? Is that a freedom for excellence or a freedom of indifference? Is this about the common good or autonomy? And these are the questions that Care for the Poor ask us. And these are the questions that the liturgy asks us, going back to the discussion of Rowan William and being a guest. So I'm not going to go a lot more into detail on this, but I just wanted to sort of set you up with the questions I hope we can discuss following this lecture.